Buenas, bienvenidos a este vídeo de unplandivino.net. Vamos a saludar aquí por orden alfabético a dos personas en Argentina. No os asustéis si se oyen las voces muy fuertes, que es solo al principio. Es Ana Pilar, ¿estás ahí?
Acá estoy, muy buenos días.
Y Claudia, ¿estás por ahí?
Hola, buenos días.
Pues vamos a
Sí,
seguir.
presente Iván.
Presentísimo. Vamos a seguir este encuentro sobre la atracción sexual. Hemos visto ya muchas cosas que impactan bastante y vamos a ver qué tal. Por aquí vamos a ver, por cierto, lo que nos quedó sin ver al principio. No esto tanto, porque esto es como muy introductorio, ya lo hemos visto en muchos otros talleres. La creación del alma y la encarnación. Luego que Dios crea todo, incluidas las almas, con una variedad casi infinita. Estos son los títulos de anteriores puntos. Hoy vamos a empezar en el 2-3. Y, por ejemplo, luego las almas no encarnadas son perfectas en el amor natural, pero no tienen consciencia de sí mismas. Estas cosas que ya las hemos visto y las comentan ahí al principio del taller. Entonces, bueno, a ver qué os parece. Empezamos con, ya digo, con este 2-3, que nos habla de diferencias entre reencarnación y encarnación. Aquí están plantando cosas que en realidad no sirven para hablar de la atracción sexual y por eso las hemos dejado para este día, que es un poco combinado, digamos, aunque van a ir dirigiéndose poco a poco al tema, que nosotros ya hemos visto como la sustancia de él, cuando vimos los dibujos de los chakras y todo eso de energías que nos comentó así básico, aunque tiene sus trucos. Bueno, vamos a seguir.
If we put the mic straight back behind you. There.
As I have understood it, when your soul is in union on the soul plane, if I can use that word, even if you have reincarnated and now is in a spirit and physical body, is that the same with us?
No, there is a difference between a person who's reincarnated and a person who is in their first incarnation. In a reincarnated condition, there is an attenuation between the connection of the soul and the bodies, the new bodies that have been created. Whereas in the original incarnation, so in my and Mary's first incarnation, which was 2,000 years ago, for us what happened is the same as yourself, and that is that in that condition you are completely connected to your bodies. So when you're first at that moment of conception, when the two bodies are created, your soul is completely enveloping those two bodies, and the soul's power is what maintains the bodies and keeps them alive, actually. That's what keeps the bodies continuing to stay alive. And so for the first incarnation, you don't have an attenuated connection between your soul and your bodies. For myself and Mary, it's very different. It's the same kind of thing in terms of dealing with emotions, because we still have to deal with emotions. But for us, we're dealing with emotions for a different reason than you are. The reason why you're dealing with emotions is because there are injuries inside of you that have been absorbed right from the moment of conception that prevent your soul from growing, and therefore prevent your soul from growing in love, and prevent your soul from conceptualizing love and conceptualizing truth. And so it's a process of learning for the first time. For the reincarnated soul, it's a little different. The process is when you incarnate, basically what you're doing is your 22nd dimension union soul is now.
Bueno, recordad que me paréis cuando queráis. Aquí pongo una nota que se requiere porque después de unos años, como hemos visto, 5 años solo después, él ya habría recordado más cómo es el mundo del espíritu en este cuerpo, y ahora habla de 36, que lo vimos un poco con Claudia, ¿verdad? Aquí pongo una nota.
Sí, recuerdo.
Miller fue recordando, y el número de planos que presenta ahora, lo pongo así, es 36, siendo ese número el de la reunión ánica, el último, el 36.
El video del universo físico, ¿verdad?
Sí.
Por si alguien lo quiere ver, digo.
Sí,
el video que explica la presentación del universo físico.
sí. Bueno, pues aquí está diciendo eso. Vamos a reenlazarlo porque nos hemos perdido un poco. Cuando encarnamos es básicamente que el alma está ahí en unidad, en el plano de reunión álmica, el 36, tendríamos que decir ahora, y está ahora sobrecubriendo 4 cuerpos. Vamos a ver cómo lo dice. Y os quiero decir aquí que es muy raro y muy gracioso. Bueno, gracioso no, siempre digo lo mismo. Que la palabra que utiliza para esto de sobrecubrir es la misma, que yo a veces lo traduzco como semiposeer, la misma que utiliza cuando habla de espíritus que siendo diferentes almas, pues sobrecubren a lo mejor a niños pequeños, o vimos en el ejemplo del aborto natural que había sobrecubierto una adulta, nueva era, una chica nueva era, pues esa es la misma palabra la que utiliza. Es curioso que utilice la misma para el alma, sobrecubriendo en esto, que es como encarnado de la reencarnación, es algo como muy fuerte, en comparación con lo otro que no tiene nada que ver con reencarnar, pero sí que, bueno, el espíritu sí que percibe, ya vimos incluso ayer, como incluso puede manipular los cuerpos y hacer que los niños tengan excitación sexual, etcétera, en abusos sexuales de adultos, cosas así, artificializan eso, o sea que ahí, entonces fijémonos ya el poder que tiene un espíritu, o sea, un ser que es un espíritu que, bueno, utilizando también, pues claro, indirectamente los poderes de su alma, sin saberlo, pues está ahí empatizando artificialmente, a propósito, quiero decir, forzadamente, y sobrecubriendo a cuerpos físicos y apartando el cuerpo espiritual de un niño, ¿no? Como vimos, o cosas así. Entonces, bueno, que utiliza la misma palabra. Y está ahora sobrecubriendo 4 cuerpos. Vamos a ver.
Overcloaking 4 bodies, 2 more spirit bodies and 2 more physical bodies.
Pero que esto es lo mismo que el alma en general, un alma completa, ¿verdad? Que aquí nadie se líe. Quiero aclarar esto para si alguien lo ve por primera vez. Un alma completa, 2 mitades, como nos lo presenta la verdad divina, es así, tal cual, siempre es 2 y 2. 2 cuerpos para nosotros y para nuestra alma gemela otros 2, porque es cuerpo espiritual y físico mal. Entonces aquí lo pinta así. En el original del PDF en inglés, que esa figura no la pongo en el PDF en español. Este es el dibujito que está. Entonces, bueno, vamos.
And the connection of these bodies to this soul initially has to begin in very, very slight way. So in other words, it has to be very, very minute connection, because the reality is the soul in that condition will kill these bodies due to the imperfection in the bodies that were created through the conception and the absorption of emotions from its parents. And so for us, what we've got to do is we go through a process of remembering our soul, and therefore allowing the memories of that soul to flow into us, into the mind of this spirit body in particular. And then along with that, the way that happens is by letting the emotions of each memory be triggered. Does that make sense? And so while we still have to do emotional processing in the same manner that you do, the emotions are going to be far more intense than what you do to clear emotion. And on top of that, they are slowly connecting a bigger pipe, if you like, towards the soul, until eventually the soul will have complete control of these 2 new bodies. So we had to start off with very, very little control over those 2 bodies, because it would damage, firstly, the parent who was carrying the child, and once the child was born, it would damage the child if the soul attempted a complete connection. And we have to re-establish that connection through a process. Now, nobody knew the process before we did it, so we had to guess about the process, and what we've had to do is find our way through that process, which is very, very different than doing it the first time, in the sense that other people could tell you this is the process because we've been through it. Does that make sense? But when you're going through the second time, particularly if you're the first people going through it, nobody can actually tell you what to do. It's like you're discovering a whole new thing for the very first time. And so you could say that from our perspective, we're going through an experiment. So what you see myself and Mary go through is an experiment. Whereas what you need to go through, you don't need to experiment with that much, because you can have other people tell you, because they have actually been through exactly the same process, if that makes sense. Yeah. So the reality is this, like Mary has drawn, this unified soul is now connected to those bodies. Right? But the conduit is very, very weak until this mind in this, not the brain of the physical body, but the mind of the spirit body, until this mind of the spirit body is able to even conceive that it has this connection and is able to allow the memories of this connection to flow to it, which are all emotional, then until then it's going to be totally unaware that it is reincarnated at any point. It's only through this process that it will become aware. Does that make sense? So that's why all of the people who have returned at this point have a period of their life where they're totally unaware, and the reason for that is because we're incarnating into a first sphere condition on the planet, and so therefore there's a lot of denial of the emotions and memories of the soul, and so it's totally unaware, and then slowly it's got to gain awareness. But that is a choice. You have to make that choice individually. Like, I can't make the choice for Mary, Mary can't make the choice for me. So it's impossible for me to go up to somebody and say to Jane, "Oh, Jane, you're one of the 14, and for it to actually have any effect on Jane. Because the reality is that unless Jane has the memories, and unless she has the emotions, unless she has the physical experience, and allows this emotional experience, so as she's dealing with emotion, unless these memories come to her, and unless she has the physical experiences that are identical to what the 14 had, then you can tell a person they're one of the 14, but it makes no difference. At the end of the day, they're going to have to go through an experience to find it out for themselves. Yeah. So there is a big difference, if you like, between the two parts. So for the majority of people in the...
Esto quiere decir, por así decirlo, hay una gran diferencia, distinción entre ambas.
Planet, we're in our first incarnation, and for the majority of people in the spirit world, they're in their first incarnation. So everything that we're discussing really is primarily based around what happens in the first incarnation with regard to sexual attraction in particular. And very similar principles also exist with regard to sexual attraction to a reincarnated soul, in the sense that it's still the emotions that are in each half of the soul that dictate a level of sexual attraction. And we'll talk about that as we go through this discussion
from
today.
our experience,
Yeah. Does that make sense? Any other questions you have about that? No? Nico was next, I think.
I would like to ask a question regarding a vision I had. I have the feeling that it is my memory, let's say, but it contradicts what you have said about it.
Yep.
At some point, I remember everything was dark, and I felt the only way to describe it is like it's during the summer that you sleep outside, and then the small bedsheet leaves your side vulnerable, and a breeze flows you, and you are a little bit, let's say, cold. And it was at that moment I opened my eyes and I saw the earth from above because I was covering, and then I just closed them again because I didn't know at that time what the whole thing was. But I don't understand how I can remember this, because I felt that it was before I incarnated.
Yes, a lot of people feel that they have memories before they incarnated of the incarnation process. And what that is spirits in the spirit world telling you what actually occurred during your own incarnation. So there is a lot of spirits in the spirit world who want to tell people on earth the truth about their own incarnation. And so what they do is they give you a series of pictures and feelings about what the soul felt during the process of the first incarnation. The first incarnation is not traumatic, with the exception of when it physically attaches to the physical and spiritual bodies. Before that point, it is not traumatic at all. So in other words, there is no trauma in the soul from the incarnation process. In the second incarnation, there is a lot of trauma in the soul through the incarnation process, because the soul is going through an experience of contradiction between a love and truth state and no love and truth, and it is totally self-aware that that is occurring. And so it feels the second incarnation, so my Mary's second incarnation felt very much different to the first incarnation. The first incarnation we were not conscious of at all, and we investigated it through in the spirit world once we passed. Well, for myself, I knew that as I was on Earth in the first century, but you can investigate it once you pass as to what the process was, only by observing other people go through the process. And so what happens is many spirits observe other people going through the process. They can't see the soul because they're not yet using their soul senses to see. They're still using their spirit body to see. So they can't see the soul, but they can see the effect it has on the energization of the two bodies that have been created, and they can feel where the soul's going, where it's coming from, and where it's going through the traces of the energy that the soul emits. And so they can see the effects of the soul, not the soul itself, and they see it. Actually, they see the process of incarnation through the energy fields that the soul actually emits, connecting to the two bodies. And then they can show you a picture of that. If you're a mediumistic person, they can show you a picture of that. And many people on the earth have been shown very complete pictures of that entire process. Many people on earth have then interpreted that as if it was their own acknowledgement of their own process. And what I'm suggesting to you is that's not the case. It's just a picture given to you from a spirit of what they have observed in this process, in order to demonstrate to people on earth the truth about the incarnation process. So I don't feel that your experience is contradictory to what's being said. It's just a spirit giving you that information.
It makes sense because...
Yeah. Habéis visto qué interesante. Os planteo que os imaginéis la situación de las almas. Nos dice que unas no encarnan a la vez, ¿no? Las dos mitades. Es lo que nos presenta y lo que sabemos desde hace un tiempo, que nos dice, ¿no? Que no, si no encarnan a la vez, ¿cómo será la vivencia de una mitad del alma cuando está como resonando, como medio en búsqueda de la otra mitad para no alejarse mucho en la primera encarnación? ¿Qué vivencia tendrá, ¿no? Porque está como entre dos mundos muy diferentes, el plano del alma, y no se entera que lo está, y el plano de la primera encarnación.
Iván, ¿eso sucedería naturalmente dentro del diseño, esa búsqueda que mencionás? O sea, no está consciente, pero como que esa incompletitud, por decir de una forma, genera esa sensación de que, porque me cuesta, como yo consciente digo, ah, claro, es lógico por decirte, pero si no está consciente, o si está consciente a nivel álmico de que son dos mitades.
Como algún proceso químico, lo puedes imaginar, ¿no? Casi, o sea, de atracción. Aunque no es
claro.
consciente de sí misma.
Ah, sí, en esencia, claro, entiendo. Sí,
pero ya tiene que bajar a seguir el camino de la primera que haya encarnado, ¿no?
Claro, claro, sí entiendo. Como parte de su sustancia sería. Ahora entiendo, sí.
Sí, ¿no? Algo así. Podemos hacerlo más rápido de...
Claro, naturalmente, sí. Una sustancia que naturalmente se atrae o sí comprende.
¿Habíais oído hablar antes de esto? Es muy curioso, yo no había oído antes de ver esto.
No. No, es más, yo había también, no pensé el nivel de profundidad que podía tener esto de la atracción sexual, pero sí me resultaba a mí, que ya lo venimos comentando en varios videos, esto del alma gemela, como dice él, uno va e investiga y averigua y aún así no fue suficiente mi inquietud para indagar y meterme a...
Sí, no, me refería
llegar.
en concreto a los recuerdos de
Ah.
encarnar. Me refería a esto que acaba de decir.
No. No,
Bueno.
no tengo algo en la memoria presente.
Yo aviso que no puedo ver lo que estás compartiendo, Iván.
¿Por qué?
Me aparece la pantalla en negro. La verdad que no sé si toqué algo o qué onda.
Mi pantalla parpadeó al principio, Iván, y yo pensé que era mi teléfono, por eso no lo comenté. Sí, varias veces quedó en negro, pero después, en este momento lo veo.
Aquí estamos normales. Pues mira a ver si puedes... simplemente salte y ahora te añado otra vez.
Bueno, hago eso.
Vamos a ver.
Hola, de nuevo.
Hola, y dale bien al Skype como normalmente lo dabas. Si necesitas salirte del Skype de la aplicación y volver a abrirla, pues también. ¿Ya ves la pantalla o no?
Ahora se ve, sí, gracias.
Vale, pues.
Bueno,
pues sigamos.
Sigamos.
I didn't feel that it was a lie. I felt happy afterwards for some reason.
Yeah.
So I didn't have fear. You know, sometimes you have doubt inside you because you know the truth.
Yeah.
But in this case, it was, this is it.
Yeah. The second incarnation and the first incarnations are very different to each other, but we want to get back to the sexual attraction part of it, because we can discuss how the nuts and bolts of how it all happens as a separate issue. But if we can get back to the sexual attraction of it, that'd be good, because in the end, the sexual attraction is very, very similar, no matter whether you're in you're coming from a reincarnation or you're coming from an incarnation. But like I said, the majority of people on the planet are coming from an incarnation, and so therefore we'll discuss everything from that point of view, if you like. Yeah. Is there any other questions about this? If we have the microphone.
I think I have little information about the 14. Could you please, what are these 14 you're talking about, and were they aware of themselves before you told them that they were on the 14, or they were?
Well, firstly, for the majority of the 14, I've never told them anything. So I've never told them that they were a person who's reincarnated or not. They've had to go through the process of experiencing that themselves. And the only reason why I told Mary was because she asked. But even the telling of a person is totally immaterial, really, because at the end of the day, the person has to go through their own experience. So Mary, if Mary wasn't one of the 14, I just said to Mary, you're one of the 14, she couldn't manufacture all of the emotions and all of the memories of our experience together. So it's impossible for her to actually accept she is one without going through a process herself that's totally independent of us. And that applies to all of the 14.
Do you know? But are you asking who are the 14? What is the who?
Yes. When I refer to the 14, they are the first 7 soul pairs that ever chose to reincarnate from the spirit world onto this earth. I'm not saying that there aren't other reincarnations occurring onto other planetary systems that are in the universe, but on this particular earth, there has only ever been, well, that they were the first 7. There have been others since, I feel, but they are the first 7.
Aquí le añado esta nota de, pues eso, como ya hablamos alguna vez, en otro taller hablaba de parejas de almas gemelas reencarnadas, pero que no tuvieron una vida completa en su primera vida física, fueron abortos naturales. También habría ya unas de este tipo, así en estos momentos. Y ahora sigue él.
And to have gone through this experience for a purpose. And the purpose is to teach these kind of principles to mankind and help mankind understand the entire process of the soul. including the, you know, understanding and receiving divine love. Now, the majority of those are not self-aware. Some of them are aware, but in very, very strong denial. So when I say the majority, it's probably the other way around. The majority of them are aware of who they are, but they're in very strong denial of their emotions. So they've gone through a period of realising who they are, but then as soon as they did that, they started getting very frightened, and as a result of their fear, they now turn off the entire process of connecting to their soul. And while they do that, there is nothing that can be done really to assist them, aside from just reminding them to connect to God and connect to their emotions. But the majority of them, of course, don't wish to do that at this point. There are only 4 who are wishing to do that in a more aware state at the moment.
4 other than you two?
No.
No, 4 including us two.
Yeah.
And I was someone who went into a lot of denial about it when I first met AJ, and I didn't want to believe it, and I tried many other hypotheses to try and discount what I was experiencing.
Mary's first mission was basically to try to convince me that I was wrong.
Because this is really cool, but don't be Jesus, because that's really scary. That was my basic premise. So
the majority of the emotions Mary first had was, no, that is all incorrect, and what you're talking about is wrong, and you're not Jesus anyway.
No, what you're teaching's right.
Well, your teaching's right, but you're not Jesus anyway, and I'm going to convince you that you're not.
Yeah.
That was the general feeling.
Have you got in touch with those the other 10?
Yes, through the law of attraction, I have actually physically met 13 of those 14. So the 7
12.
pairs. So I've personally met 13 of them. One of them's now passed, but there's one that I have not met.
So that's only 12, Dave, because you're off the 14th.
Oh yeah, sorry. Yeah. Of course, I've met myself. But, so yes, so I've met 12 of the others, but there's one that I have not met at this point. And I don't believe I'm going to meet soon either, that one person. Why? Because the location on the earth where that person lives, I'm aware of where she lives, and also the different degrees of separation between myself and herself at this point in time, because of the location in which she lives. And when I say the degrees of separation, do you understand what I mean? Like, you know, I know you, you know somebody else, you know somebody else, and you know, actually for every person on the earth, they suggest there's around 6 degrees of separation, basically, where you know someone who knows someone who knows someone 6 times, and eventually there's a correlation there between the 2 people, even though they don't know each other. Now, in my case with this particular person, the one person I have not met, I can feel the number of degrees of separation between the people who know her and the people who know those people and so forth, back into the people who know myself or have heard of myself. And at the moment, I can feel that is almost 6 degrees of separation between the 2 of us. Whereas for all of the others, there is no degree of separation at this point. And I can't explain the reason why that's the case. It's just the way it's working. And I feel strongly that it's to do with the soulmate. I have met the soulmate of the person, but the soulmate doesn't want to activate his soulmate longing at all. He's totally closed down to doing any emotional work. He's aware of who he is. His name's John the Baptist from the 1st century. He's aware of who he is, but he has no desire to do with any emotions. He has no desire to accept any truths. He has no desire to, at this point, connect with myself and Mary and talk with us about the process. He has no desire to do any of those things. And in particular, he has no desire to connect to his soulmate. So at the moment, he is quite separate from his soulmate, and that's causing the difficulty for us to connect to her. He has a female soulmate. Yeah. Does that make sense? Is that it, Dionysus? That was it? Sure.
Do you know what happened to the one who was passed? I mean, if he was in the first sphere again,
when any of the 14 pass, they will automatically go to the condition that their soul has attracted due to their condition that they're on earth. And in John's case, it was the Apostle John who passed. He arrived in the first dimension of the spirit world, in the first sphere. He had to work through emotions, which he worked through quite rapidly because he started remembering his spirit life from the first time quite rapidly. And some of his children from the first century came to speak with him and so forth, and there was a lot of memories that came up as a result. So within a period of 3 months, he was totally aware of who he was. He wasn't in denial anymore about who he was. And then within a period of 3 years, he's now in the 17th or 18th dimensional spaces.
Denise, if you think about, you know, how we were talking about how the soul still is in the 22nd sphere and there's this attenuated connection. The only thing that happens when one of the 14 passes is the physical body's gone and the spirit body still has to regain that connection. So it's still the same emotional process.
But it's a faster process because they're now meeting the same people that they remember. Does that make sense? So it's like you're almost forced into it in the spirit world because there's all this memory. With all your memories, and this applies to whether you're in your first incarnation or not, all of your memories are locked away inside of you until there's a point of contact, until there's a point of trigger, a trigger point that actually allows the memory to flow. So even with your own childhood memories, many of your own childhood memories at the moment are completely suppressed, and they will remain suppressed until such a time as you have a connection point between the emotions you're denying that hold those memories or that are about those memories and the memories themselves. Once there is a complete openness between the emotion and the memory, then the memory will flow in its complete detail. So some of you will go for a period of time in your life where you don't remember, you know, what you did when you were 4 years of age, for example, and then all of a sudden something will trigger you, and now you remember. Esto
es lo que contabas ayer, Iván, que había suprimido tu recuerdo y que algo activó la emoción y
No,
lo conectaste.
La verdad es que recordarlo lo recordaba. Lo único que el hecho de saber la verdad de lo que pasó y de que hay un espíritu que activa sexualmente me va a permitir, yo creo, recordar más y sentir más puramente la vergüenza causal o las cosas que tenga que sentir y no sentí en ese momento, porque al no querer sentirlas te vas del cuerpo y entra el espíritu y ya usa tu cuerpo un poco.
Yo pensé que no, claro, no era que no lo recordaba, sino que no estaba, entiendo, que no estaba descifrado, por decir, sí, ahora entiendo.
Vale, bueno.
The same for all of the people who have reincarnated. They have to go through these series of connection points through their experience to actually, and then allow the emotions to be present before they will remember. And many of the 14 who were the first 14 to reincarnate have a deep resistance to doing that process. It's a deep resistance to remembering anything about what or who they were. And as a result of that, they are resisting their memories quite strongly. Now, in some cases, they're accepting their memories, but like John the Baptist accepts many of his memories, but he's not processing the emotions. He's not working his way through the issues of love and truth, and he's not allowing the memories to change his life. And so nothing can happen until that allowance occurs. Yeah. Does that make sense? Yeah, thank you. Okay, so that's a summary of the soul's incarnation. Now, what does that have to do with sex? Is the question, right? So what we need to do is focus now on what this particular incarnation process, how and what effect that has on sexuality, on sexual attraction. Okay, so here we have the two halves of the soul. Let's look at a heterosexual couple. So remember they're in their bodies now, so we'll just draw their bodies as a little side point because really the bodies are just a little side point to the soul. The soul envelops, and covers those bodies. In other words, the soul provides the energy for those bodies to exist. And a lot of the connection, as soon as when a person passes, the soul is no longer connected with one of those bodies, and therefore the body cannot exist. It's quite simple. And from that moment on, it'll decay eventually until it decays to nothing, as does everything that it doesn't have energy on God's universe. it decays to another form of energy. It always occurs like that. So here we have the two halves with their bodies. Oh, the guy's got his hand up in the air there. Hooray! We're incarnated. Ray sex, is that it? So the two halves are incarnated, right? So now, and let's say they're now beginning this process of growing. In other words, they're developing, they're absorbing things from the universe and therefore absorbing things from their experience. So they're starting to feel things from other people, in other words, in particular from other people, but they have other experiences going on as well. They start developing emotionally as well, and they start growing. And during this period of growth, the first few years of growth, there isn't very much of a focus on connection with the other half of themselves because they're still discovering themselves. So therefore, there's very little connection with the other half of yourself, with the exception of energy flowing between the two halves of the soul. In other words, if I'm only 2 years of age, I have a very slightly developed intellect in comparison to when I'm 8 years of age. I have a very slightly developed awareness of myself when I'm 2 in compared to when I'm 7, and in comparison to when I'm 20. So in that very slight condition of personal awareness when I'm 2 years of age, it's very, very hard for me then to become aware, even with an intellectual concept of some kind, that I have another half and be aware of where that other half is. Is there any questions about the state of growing?
Just, sorry, grab some water.
I wanted to know, is the soul aware of the other? The two bodies, one body.
Yes, the soul is aware of the other half. This is the interesting thing, is that because of the multi-generational injuries on the planet, there is very, very little awareness of soulmates on the planet. So the average person who is born onto this planet, who is incarnated onto this planet, firstly conceived and then born, absorbs the belief system very, very rapidly of its parent.
Voy a silenciar, si puedo, por aquí, no sé. Te silencio, Claudia, y luego cuando quieras puedes, porque estoy oyendo ruidos que a lo mejor son...
And almost all parents on the planet have the belief system that, you know, you can connect to anybody. You know, there's lots of people you could spend the rest of your life with. It's just a choice. And so this belief system influences the intellect of the spirit body's mind of the child, and so therefore it feels quite unknowing in terms of, from a very young age, unknowing of a potential connection between itself and its other half.
It's not unknowing, it's blocked.
It's blocked.
It's already blocked.
It's blocked to the connection through the emotional impact of the parents. But the souls themselves can still have information. The two halves still have information flowing between them. And often that will remain for the entire of their life, no matter how much we're denying it in our mind. So there is this thing that can happen all through your life, actually, where you have this really strange feeling sometimes that something's happening to someone else and you don't even know that other person, let alone know what's happening to them, but there's something not very nice. You know, in other words, there's this connection with some and feelings of, what do you call it? The Apostle John would call it discombobulation. feelings of...
An unsettled.
Es que aquí utilizan la palabra divertida del inglés, por eso se ríen, para desconcertante. Sentimiento inquietante.
An unsettled feeling inside of yourself, not understanding any reason why you feel so unsettled or anything like that, but the reality is that often it's the other half of yourself that's quite unsettled or going through some pain or suffering, and one half, your half, is feeling that. So yes, there is an energy flow of information and emotions and feelings to the other half of the soul, and that will always be the case. However, the more intellectually shut down we become, our soul becomes like a dried out broom. So if you could think about it, as I'm shutting down myself, shutting down my desires, shutting down my passion, shutting down love, this is something that happens throughout our life generally. What happens is this soul, instead of looking the nice, pristine, let's say that's the soul shape for an example, now it's looking like this, like this withered up prune, like that's what it looks like. Very little energy coming out of it. And because there's very little energy coming out of it to anything, there is also very little energy coming out of it to its other half. So its other half may be in a pristine condition, right? But this half would not feel very much of the other half in that condition. Does that make sense? To the spirit who we're passing.
Yeah, the spirit, he actually passed, and on Earth he actually had tendencies towards both sexes, but he was confused sexually himself. So he wanted to know about himself as to when he passed, he became aware that he was just a male and not. We believed he was a female. So he's really confused.
Right. So there is a lot of sexual confusion, not only on Earth, but also in the spirit world, and we want to discuss why that is the case as a part of this discussion today.
Yeah, and if you want to know about the differences in the quality of love between the soul when they're incarnated to the quality of love that you guys have, is it just quantity of love that you receive, or is it that your soul grows in a way that...
Well, no, because before you can reincarnate, you've got to go through a union. To go through the union, you've got to receive quite a lot of divine love, which is very, very different to natural love. So the reality is that there will be different qualities. So he will see in our spirit body, for instance, it does look quite different, even though he can see the injuries in my bodies here, and he can see the injury across my chest here, and a bit on this shoulder, and a bit around my throat. So he can see those injuries, but he can also see behind that and see that the actual chakras of the spirit body are different to the person like yourself. Even though we might be in exactly the same condition of brightness in terms of our bodies, you can see that there are actual different things that are different in each body because of, and it's very different from a reincarnated. When a spirit looks at a reincarnated person, they see a very different person than a person who's in their first incarnation.
Yeah, I think he was confused in terms of God's love. Does it have attributes to it? So
yes.
That he's so confused about.
Yes, God's love has
the love that he hasn't received, and that's giving him confusion. So
that's right.
He hasn't received that aspect.
God's love, when you receive it, changes, or you could say enhances, many of the attributes of the soul. The natural personality of the soul is enhanced, but also it changes the condition of the spirit body quite markedly. So what he observes with his spirit body eyes will be very, very different between a person who's incarnated and a person in the first incarnation and a person who's reincarnated. So if he has a look at this audience here, can he see that there is a person in the audience with a very similar spirit body to myself and Mary, even though it's not quite as bright?
That's what he's attracted to. So that's why he's trying to work out why he doesn't have.
Right, so he can see that there's one other person in that state and he's trying to understand why. And that's just the difference between the spirit body of the person who is incarnated for the first time and the spirit body of the person who's reincarnated. They're very different spirit bodies in terms of how they look to another spirit. Sorry.
No, he's looking forward to the rest of the
Yeah,
discussion.
that's what I was going to say. I think he's...
As we proceed with the discussion, we will answer many of the questions of why did these attractions happen on Earth? What's driving attraction on Earth? Why do many people on Earth feel they're attracted to males and females? What is it about bisexuality? Why do many people feel that there is such a thing as bisexuality when obviously if we're talking about soulmate attraction here, obviously there's only one attraction, not two. So why do many people attracted to both genders and so forth? So we can answer all of those questions as we proceed. Also, when we pass into the spirit world, we still have the same groups of emotional injuries that drove sexual attraction on Earth. And for that reason, many spirits who pass into the spirit world in the first to the third dimensions, so into the third spheres, they still believe they have attractions in a certain direction. And many times they only discover that they don't once they hit the fourth and fifth dimensional spaces in the spirit world with condition of love. And many of them, before then, don't really understand why those attractions exist. And what we want to do today is explain why those attractions exist. Dennis, you had a question?
¿Qué tal? ¿Estamos vivos? Recuerdo a Claudia, por si se ha tenido que salir antes por algo de los perros o algo, que la tuve que silenciar, que se oían unos sonidos por ahí.
Estoy Iván. No, yo supongo que es más bien la chapa, que hay acá un viento muy fuerte. Yo estoy en la cocina.
Ah, vale. Pues
Ahí se escucha un perro. Dale, ahí me en silencio.
no, debía ser otra. Sí. Vale. Pues nada, sigamos.
Yeah, the withered prune of a soul.
Yeah.
That explains why we have so much resistance to actually getting into our emotions in the first place.
Yes. Unfortunately, when in our first incarnation in particular, because our soul is fully connected to the bodies, we are very much going to absorb the environmental conditions that the soul has incarnated into. And as a result of this absorption, which happens very, very rapidly, we learn to shut down emotional pathways in our soul quite rapidly. We also shut down, due to the belief systems and getting feelings of approval from parents and so forth, we shut down many of the truths that our soul could be aware of quite rapidly as it gains self-awareness. But unfortunately, even the discovery of those truths get shut down as well. And so we finish up in the process of the incarnation, sort of being born even in a withered state from a soul perspective. And then, of course, that withered state grows usually. It's very rare for the withered state to actually, be released. It actually usually grows as we, experience. Yeah, the withered state grows. In other words, our soul shrinks as our growth in the physical continues, because our environment projects more and more and more and more at us that we are still trying to maintain, and eventually we get into addictions, we start closing down desires. And in particular, the most difficult soul to help have an awareness in the spirit world is the soul that has no desires. In other words, it went through life like in a very laissez-faire, sort of way, in the sense that it went through life not really make choices, not really making decisions, letting other people dictate to itself its life. And when that kind of a person passes in the spirit world, they often have very, very little bit of soul energy. It's sometimes better on earth to exercise your soul in an actively negative way or an actively positive way. In other words, to either be hot or cold, but not to be lukewarm, because it's the people who are lukewarm that often in the spirit world take the longest to actually open up and change.
Okay.
So that withered state is a very hard state to even determine any truth about yourself, let alone the truth about your sexual attractions.
It'd be great, I reckon, if we talked about how God created this system in a pure way, right? Because we're going to talk a lot about the injuries, but it gets really heavy if we don't see the beautiful picture that God actually created, and I feel we're already gone.
So let's do that.
Yeah. So how does soul attraction work, sexual attraction work from God's perspective?
Well, in reality, from God's perspective, there really isn't such a thing as sexual attraction, in the sense that you can be attracted to any person of the opposite gender. The reality is, from God's perspective, that there is only this thing that attracts the two halves of the soul. In other words, what you would call the soulmate attraction, right? So if we call that soul attraction, in its pure state, the only person that you would ever be sexually attracted to all of your life would be the other half of yourself. So in other words, your soul.
Ahí está el dibujito, ¿no?
Oh, mate, you would never actually feel a feeling of sexual attraction to any other person. So you could have like 100 women all lined up naked, but your soulmate lined up in those naked women. And if you're a male and you have a heterosexual attraction, if you're in a pure state, none of those naked women would ever cause you to have any sexual feelings whatsoever. But as soon as you were opposite your soulmate, immediately you'd have an erection. Does that make sense? That's how it would be. It would be just exactly, it would be pure, right to the point that it wouldn't matter what condition those other women were in, how beautiful they were physically, whatever, you know, how attractive they were or anything like that would not make any difference to your sexual response. Because your sexual response would be only dependent upon your soulmate response. So in other words, you could only ever have a sexual attraction.
O sea, ahí se refiere de la respuesta del tipo alma gemela, no de la otra persona que es tu alma gemela que responda. No, solo depende del tipo de respuesta alma gemela, digamos. Ese tipo.
Attraction to the other half of yourself, no other person. That's what God created to be in the pure state. So in that state, we could all live naked on the planet, couldn't we? And never have any response to anybody else sexually except to the other half of ourselves, which is in fact the way God created it to be. Does that make sense?
And Bogue, how did God create this? So God created us to incarnate and individuate, but God has designed certain things that cause the attraction between the halves of the soul.
Yeah.
Can you talk about that?
There are three primary things that we need to focus on with the attraction between the two halves of the soul. And these primary things you already know about, actually. So that's a blessing, right? You already know them. The first primary thing that causes a huge sexual attraction between the two halves of the soul is truth. When only even one half of these two halves get into a condition where they begin facing their truth, and I'm not talking about intellectual truth here, I'm talking about actually feeling the truth about things, all of a sudden, the other half, no matter what its condition is, will be sexually attracted to that half. Right? And when I say sexually attracted, it will feel a draw and a desire to be with the person who's in the condition of truth.
So this condition is, say, if it's the masculine half of the soul, it's a condition of truth about what is my true soul condition right now? What is it I'm really feeling?
What is my personality?
What is my personality?
What is my desires?
Yeah.
And it will know the truth of all those things. And the more it knows the truth of all those things, the much stronger pressure, you could say, or attraction
yeah,
there is on its mate. No matter what its mate's condition, it will be drawn. And it might not even like many of the things that it sees, but it will still be drawn. It can't help itself, basically, to be drawn to the other half through this aspect of truth.
And that's what happened with us.
Does that make sense?
AJ was in a large, he was fully like living in the truth of his identity, of his passions and desires. He was living in his desires. He was facing a lot of emotional truth constantly about himself. And I felt compelled towards this man, but I also felt like, no, I don't like this about him, and I really don't like this, and I don't want this kind of life, but I couldn't stay away. Yeah.
So even there are times when Mary went away, and even during those times, her life became more tumultuous because she could feel like, I have to go back. I have just this feeling of drawing back, and that happens through truth. So if I stayed in a condition of error, not facing my own identity, not facing my personality, who I am, what I desire, what I long for, and I shut down all of those things, now Mary's part of the soul cannot feel any of that. And unless Mary's part of the soul enabled all of those things, I wouldn't have ever been drawn to her, and therefore we would never find each other as a result. Sense? So truth is a major part of the soul opening to its other half. Without truth, you cannot open to your other half. Now, if you think about it, this relates a lot, doesn't it, to a normal relationship. A normal relationship, we cover truth over quite frequently. No, I don't want to say that because I'll hurt them. I don't want to say that because they'll be angry with me. I don't want to say that because they'll feel bad about themselves, and so forth and so forth and so forth. So we have a whole lot of unwritten rules, a whole list of them, of unwritten rules that we make so that we don't tell the truth to each other. Now, what I'm suggesting is if you're still very attracted to your partner, but you don't tell them the truth, then it can only be codependent addictions that are attracting you to each other, not a soulmate attraction. Now, by the way, two halves of the soul can live in codependent addiction with each other without actually knowing that they're soulmates. So it's possible to live together in that state as soulmates, not knowing that you're soulmates even, until you deal with the codependent addictions. But it's truth that actually shatters all codependent addictions. So it's truth that actually destroys all sympathetic attractions, which we'll talk about in a minute. We'll talk about the sympathetic attractions of the soul. Second thing, desire. How can the other half of you feel you when you are shutting down you? Does that make sense? If you're shutting down your desires and passions, in other words, your real self, how is it ever going to be possible that the other half of your real self will ever discover you, no matter what their condition is? Impossible. So what we need to do is we need to learn to connect to desire. And I'm not just talking about sexual desire here. I'm talking about all forms of desire. So we do need to connect to our sexual desire, but we also need to connect to all other forms of desire and passion. In other words, all the desires and passions that are a part of your personality, you need to allow yourself to personally discover and connect to and embrace passionately. When you embrace those things passionately, the other half of your soul will feel you. When you try to shut those things down and you don't embrace them passionately, the other half of your soul will not be able to feel you. Does everyone see that? Okay. You want to mention the third?
No, you go for it.
Third, obviously, is love. So when we talk about love, we're not talking about codependent sympathetic addictions or expectations and demands. You see, in many relationships today, what we see happening is I might have a demand coming out of me. Please cook my dinner. That's my demand. Right? Okay. The woman who's willing to cook my dinner, I feel loves me. The woman who's not willing to cook my dinner, I feel doesn't love me. Does that make sense? Just that one demand, I will basically base it upon that demand being met as to whether she loves me or not. Now, is love dependent on whether the person cooks my dinner or not? Obviously not, but it's amazing how many times we feel that. You be in a relationship and come home after a hard day's work and find the other person spent the whole day by the pool and hasn't cooked your dinner, and see what you feel. Many of us feel very upset in that place, right? Because we do have a feeling inside of our soul that love would mean that she would have cooked my dinner for me, right? That's just one thing. Now, love is not the same as demand. So it's not demands, right? It's not expectations, and is not addictions. So I'll just put not those things. Now, unfortunately, for many relationships today, the whole relationship is based upon those things. I will meet your demands as long as you meet my demands. I will meet your addictions as long as you meet my addictions. I will meet your expectations as long as you meet my expectations. I will have a feelings transmitted to you that I love you as long as you make me feel safe and secure and supported and so forth. But as soon as you make me feel unsafe and insecure and unsupported, I then feel you don't love me. So in other words, our definitions of what love is will drive the attraction. Now, if the soul half, one soul half, is in a more pure state of love, in other words, they don't have demands, they don't have expectations, they don't have addictions with the opposite gender, the opposite gender will be more attracted, and in particular the soulmate half will be more attracted to them as a result. Does that make sense to everyone?
Yeah.
You wanted to?
I just wanted to talk about, you finished about,
Yeah, I think so.
About what...
Does everyone have any questions about that before we proceed?
I don't want to go ahead. Yeah, so go ahead.
Sorry? Can you use the microphone? Thank you. There's some reason we're not. Are we getting the sound? We're not. There's something wrong with that mic, so we can get the other mic over.
You shouldn't have to turn the mics on or off ever. They're always on, and Igor just adjusts the volume. So
if Igor can just check that mic for us.
So I think it works. So I think I heard you say that if there is no expectation coming from the one person, the other half's love or attraction will be stronger.
Yes, as long as the other is not in codependent addiction too. You follow me?
Yeah.
Because if the other have a codependent addiction, then of course there would still be a block. So in other words, if Mary no longer, as she's worked through her emotions, and she no longer has a feeling that to be a good woman, she has to cook a meal for a man. Let's say she's worked through that and she doesn't feel that anymore. And I still feel like a good woman will always cook me a meal when I come home from work. Now, Mary's worked through her blockage about it. In other words, she no longer believes the man, that she has to do that for the man. But me still having the expectation is going to affect our joining, isn't it? Because I'm going to then believe she doesn't love me. And if I believe she doesn't love me, then I probably won't want to be with her.
So, but perhaps this is what I wanted to get to. These three factors, the more the soul develops, the more the half of the soul develops in these three things, the more there is, if we maybe don't use the word attraction, because we associate the word attraction with this feeling of desire, yeah, I want you, but it's more like a magnetism, if you like. There's a drawing together of the soul halves. And that's...
Aquí se han comido en la transcripción y habla de magnetismo. O sea, es más como un magnetismo. Más tienen ese magnetismo.
Part of God's process to confront the error in the other half of the soul.
Now, can everyone see what Mary's saying? Because it's really important. I think it's important to see that what Mary's saying is that there is an attraction. The soul, the two halves of the soul will be attracted to each other, not necessarily sexually at this point, but if they were in truth, desire and love and in perfect in that, they would also be attracted sexually, of course. So it depends whether we're comparing a perfect thing where we've released all of our emotion, or now what we're doing is talking about the imperfect thing. Now, what I'm saying is if we're perfectly in truth, perfectly in desire, perfectly in love, in other words, at that point, you would probably be at one with God, right? Then at that point, the other half of your soul will be drawn to you, not necessarily sexually attracted at this point to you, but will be magnetically, as Mary used the term, drawn to you.
Yeah. So, and perhaps I just wanted to talk about what God has created in the soulmate relationship, because it is this, it's, remember the other half of your soul is the other half of you. So you're very matched in terms of your passions and desires, your loves, your creativity, what you would most like to do with this individuation that you've been given. And when you come together without injury, there's like, well, as we teach, eventually there's a complete merging back into one soul. But before then, there's this beautiful experience of the sharing of love energy, for want of a better word, a part of which is unique and sexual for that person. And but
the sexual is only a part.
It's a part of this beautiful connection that can exist, and it's like a flow of emotion, of energy between the two halves. Yeah. And
so in other words, if Mary activates her desires strongly, I will actually not only feel that more strongly attracted to her just generally. In other words, I'll be attracted to the fact that she now has these desires, because if I'm activating my desires, I can feel, her desires and my desires are pretty much identical to each other, and that then is, of course, going to cause an attraction. But on top of that, it also, if I'm clear emotionally, will open up different parts of my body and cause me to feel a stronger sexual attraction to Mary as well. We'll talk about the relationship between these other attractions and sexual attraction as we go.
Yeah. And just what it feels like to me, you know, when you're talking about the demands, expectations and addictions, very often, even if the couple are two halves of the one soul, it feels to me like we create, it's almost like the facade self. There's like there's this murky division between us where we're just wanting, you make me feel good about this injury, I'll make you feel good about that one. And we have this kind of, it's not even a connection between the souls. It's a connection to help us avoid our souls.
It's a connection between the...
Esta es la barrera esa que apuntamos.
fake selves.
Yeah.
Not the real self.
Yeah.
Remember, the soul is the real self God created. And the fake selves are the selves we create in order to avoid the pain of what our parents created, which is a long way separate from what God created.
Yeah.
Soul attractions, so the true attraction between soulmate halves is based on what God created is inside of these souls, the personality and nature of these souls.
Yeah. And so even the most fantastic relationship we feel we're in or we've ever had right now, it's really like in comparison to this beautiful connection and sharing, openness, joy, sexual union, this flow between two individuals. This thing that we think is the best thing we've ever had doesn't compare at all to the beauty that comes from this open space of feeling your true perfect mate, really. Yeah.
Can we also illustrate, can you see physically how when you are two, let's say you're a couple that are not soulmate, a couple, and you're drawn together and you're in this binding, even if you're in perfect condition of love, so both, even if you were both at one with God, in harmony with truth, desire and love, and I suggest to you, if you were doing those things, you probably still wouldn't be in a relationship. But let's say you were still in a relationship with the person sexually, and I feel personally that that's impossible. And I haven't ever seen anybody in the last 2,000 years of my existence in that state. But if that could be the case, each half of the soul would have completely different desires. They would have completely different personality because they are belonging to a different couple altogether, their soulmate is somebody else. And as a result of that, to stay in the relationship, they'd have to overlook the fact that we have completely different desires and we have completely different passions and we have a completely different measure of truth inside of us. Like every soul, even in its pristine state, has completely different aspects of its personality. And as a result of that, there's an automatic gradual separation of the couple as they grow towards God, if they are not soulmates. There's going to be an automatic separation of the couple. Now, in the first century, I was asked the question, a woman had 7 partners while she was on earth. She was married 7 times. Which one of those men would she stay with then if she was in the spirit world, was the question that I was asked. And I said, none of them, potentially, because she would become like the angels in the spirit world. And what I meant was she would become only attracted to her soulmate, whoever that might be, and whoever that might be might not be any of those 7 men. And therefore she would be with none of them. That's what I meant in that discussion. So the reality is, unless we engage these things inside of ourselves, how can we ever attract the other half of ourselves? It's very, very difficult to attract the other half of ourselves.
But the beautiful thing is that as we do, it will happen naturally.
Automatically.
Yeah.
It will happen automatically.
God created this process so that you would find your soulmate. As long as you engage these things, you're going to find them.
Yeah. And the reality, as we've mentioned earlier, there is energy flowing between the two soul halves, even in an unconscious state. So the reality is your soul and your own mate are aware of each other at some level. The key is for you now to become, aware in your mind as well as in what's going on between you emotionally. And this is something that is going to require these things to be activated in you. Now, this is the reason why most people never find their soulmates until they enter the fifth sphere of the spirit world. Because by the time they've entered the fifth sphere, in the third sphere they've learnt the lessons of truth. Generally in the fourth sphere they've learnt the lessons of desire. Like completely, they're in their desires and passions at this stage. And they're obviously received a lot of love at this point, and God if they're progressing on the divine love path, but they're obviously in a lot of love if they're on the natural love path. And because of those three things being activated, they usually draw their soulmate to them by the time they enter the fifth sphere of the spirit world. Now, on Earth, we don't have to wait that long. We can attract our soulmate at any point in time in our progress, but of course, we do need to address these issues in a pure way before we're going to actually know who our soulmate is, even. Now, it's interesting because every soul has a signature of itself. When I say a signature, I'm talking about all of these aspects that make up your characteristics and personality. You could say that every single soul has its own individual characteristics and personality and attributes. And this is why when you get to a condition where you're open emotionally to feeling these things, you can go up to a person and go, wow, that person feels very much like that person over there. And, you start seeing the linkage between... and so for myself and Mary, we often meet people who are often in different relationships or not in relationships at all. We go, yeah, those two are soulmates, but we don't tell them. We just let them work through the emotions that they need to work through before they'll become aware of it themselves. And because you can actually feel the character or nature of each person's soul once you become open emotionally to doing that. And you can feel the differences in the character and nature of each person's soul. And so when two people feel identical in their nature, even though they may be in a different form physically, like so one might be in a male body and another one in a female body, you go, whoa, these are probably soulmates, right? You can feel the signature, if you like, of their soul. Is there any questions about that so far?
I have a question. I just wanted to ask a question about truth.
Yep.
You said that when one half of the soul faces the truth about itself. Now, does that mean, or the injuries, the addictions, what exactly?
Not just the injuries and addictions, also its pure personality. So in other words, the half of its soul needs to come to allow itself to discover itself. So this is where desires and passions are a big part of that as well, in terms of what is the truth of my nature? What kind of things do I really enjoy compared to what my parents told me I should enjoy, for example? What kind of things do I really love compared to what my parents told me I should love? What kind of things do I really have a passion for compared to what my environment tells me I should have a passion for?
So naturally in that process, you're actually facing your addictions, your injuries, all that stuff.
So the reality is when you face these truths inside of yourself, you automatically face the addiction. And because of that, you now are in this space, and because you're in that space, through your own soul, your own soul is now feeling itself. And because it's feeling itself, remember I said earlier, if you can't feel yourself, how can another person feel you easily, particularly if the other person's shut down towards themselves too? Well, it's very difficult. But if you can now feel yourself and you activate yourself and you feel and stay in your passions and desires, what effect does that have on everyone around you? Everyone around you, they feel like they know you better, and that they can feel you they can feel these things coming out of you. So therefore, there's a feeling of recognition that they have of you, you know, and they can feel your passions and desires. Now that applies very much so to your soulmate, of course. So your soulmate feeling you is a powerful thing. So if you're not feeling you, then how can your soulmate feel you? It's pretty hard. It's pretty hard to put your soulmate to do that. So far what we've done, we've talked about the actual process of incarnation, and then what we've talked about is how joining or attraction occurs between the two halves of the soul if they're in a state of perfection. And also we've talked about how the truth, desires, and love are the things to activate within yourself, whether you're in error or not. They are the things to activate within yourself if you want to draw your soulmate to you. Right? But we've yet to discuss sexual attraction. You see? We've discussed these principles, but we've yet to discuss sexual attraction. So what we need to do is we need to now put sexual attraction together with these other principles. Right?
Y aquí empezaría lo que vimos de eso, del flujo de la energía y todo eso, del apartado 6. Bueno, ¿qué tal? ¿Queréis comentar algo relacionado con esto o con lo de los otros días? ¿Cansadas?
Bueno, comentarios como que todo se va complementando, se va desmenuzando.
Se te corta un poco, no sé. La llamada.
Yo los vi bien, los escucho bien. Hay mucho viento por esta zona. Quizás sea eso o no.
Vale, veamos a ver si se mejora. Sí, como que todo encaja muy bien.
Iván, yo de lo que veníamos viendo desde hace tiempo ya, si bien no habíamos profundizado esto, entendía como que el condicionante era la relación con Dios. Acá ellos, no sé si tácitamente la están implicando en la medida que uno se haga consciente de sí mismo, sea en armonía con el amor y la verdad, sea consciente y pueda
Claro,
proceso desencadenar.
Es verdad que no lo había pensado. Sí, yo, en la medida en que recibe más amor divino, el proceso es más rápido. Pero fíjate que están incluyendo a los infinitos caminos del amor natural, que puedes llamarlo camino del amor natural. Claro. Incluyendo a ellos, y por lo tanto ahí tienes que explicar, y él lo que han hecho aquí es esbozar cuáles son los ingredientes que también a las personas que de alguna manera, digamos, rechazan el amor divino, que somos todos por defecto cuando entramos en la Tierra, pues también les llega normalmente en la quinta dimensión, ha dicho, les llega el alma gemela, claro, porque ellos siguen creciendo en amor y en verdad, porque van juntos, y por lo tanto en deseo, porque la autenticidad de la verdad implica eso, ¿no? La autenticidad en el deseo. Entonces, claro, ha tenido que incluirlos.
Bien, era eso, gracias.
Claro, aquí fíjate que lo deben hacer para que no se despiste mucho la gente, ¿no? Porque de repente si empiezan a hablar del amor divino, como quieren que pregunte la gente, empiezan a preguntar y la cosa se puede ir por otra parte, ¿no? Si ya se ha ido mucho de por sí en el comienzo con el tema de la reencarnación y todo eso.
Claro, sí, igual por ahí cuando uno tiene así como una panorámica ya de lo que fueron los otros talleres e incluso el paso por los del 2016 que estuvieron bastante focalizados en esto del deseo, la actitud frente al cambio y el miedo y el amor, entonces como que uno de alguna forma, por decirte, comprendo, así como acá mencionó la dimensión número 22 y después incorpora la 36, y ellos mismos dicen, digamos, en la página de de Divine Truth explican que la verdad en sí, la verdad de Dios es imposible conocerla completamente, que se va abriendo a medida que nos abrimos nosotros y que por supuesto esto evoluciona en el mismo proceso. Incluso hablo de Miller y Mary, digamos, de Jesús y María, en el que están viviendo acá. Entonces que por ahí, claro, comprendo que estos talleres, por decirte, se puede ver que hay como una forma incluso de conectar y de trabajar y que va evolucionando hacia los últimos. Así que también, claro, puede ser, yo la había condicionado, si se quiere, o la había restringido a esa relación con Dios como único, digamos, o principal requisito, que acá cuando ellos nombran los tres no la mencionan. Por eso, a eso apuntaba mi observación.
Sí, es muy curioso. Que no claro, pero lo quieren centrar mucho en la atracción sexual, pero tienen que hablar de la gemela, y entonces es como que meten las mínimas cosas posibles, quizá yo creo que es eso. Porque date cuenta que sí, para él desde el principio, desde el 2005 por lo menos, lo que empieza a escribir ya es todo el rato la relación con Dios, es lo...
Sí, sí.
Pero sí.
Claro.
Lo básico.
Bien.
Pues sí.
Anita, Ana, yo te escuchaba con eco, como si estuvieras en un lugar muy cerrado o muy... Eso nomás escuchaba yo, pero te escuchaba.
No, por ahí pueden haber interferencias y hace un par de días que hay viento, pero como que estoy en el lugar de la casa habitual, ¿no? Sí. Yo escuché bien esa primera parte que no vi solamente y el resto bien.
Vale, ahora se te ve también un poco como la voz diferente a otros días, más borrosa, debe ser los espíritus, quizá, no sabemos. Y a lo mejor eso tenemos que bueno, podemos dejar de grabar y hablamos un poco a ver qué tal, porque tengo preparado una cosa de que nos puede llevar solo 5 minutos, si queremos hacer un vídeo breve, que es una cosa muy interesante, que la podemos... Bueno, ahora os lo comento y comentáis más, si no, a no ser que tengáis más cosas que comentar de esto.
No, yo no.
¿No? Bueno, pues, como digo siempre, despediros de vuestro amado público y gracias por...
Perdón, Iván, no podía desactivar el micrófono, perdón, llegó tarde. Lo único que quería decir es que esto de alguna manera refleja que nada implica esfuerzo en el diseño de Dios, digamos que todo es una invitación al autoconocimiento, pero que todo está, como ya lo vimos en ese video del entorno, todo está puesto y dispuesto en la creación para que te ocupes simplemente de ti.
De sentir.
Y eso que es,
fíjate,
claro, de sentir, sí.
De la humildad bien entendido, sí.
Claro, entonces yo comprendo de alguna manera porque ellos dicen justamente esto, o sea, automáticamente en la tierra que tenemos parte de esa experiencia todavía, quienes tengamos o estamos atravesando en este momento, pero como esa, si se quiere, esa experiencia que de alguna manera parece como tan mecánica acá, o de buscar o de tener que escanear, y cuando comenta lo de la dirección, como yo digo, ahí está la condición álmica expresándose, como está todo el tiempo, a través del cuerpo. Está tan recortado también el tema de la dirección, por ejemplo, como un mecanismo fisiológico separado, por decir, incluso, manipulado, malinterpretado. Y cómo ahí la expresión del alma, que es algo tan hermoso, que por eso siento esa conexión con Mary cuando dice que quiero que conozcan la belleza de lo que es el diseño. Que realmente algo, uno no deja de encontrar, hablo por mí, no dejo de encontrar esa armonía, la perfección en su máxima expresión y este ahorro, si se quiere, esta idea de que no tienes que hacer, o sea, ya está hecho. Y pasa con todas las leyes, ¿no? Incluso las vamos a ir descubriendo a medida que estemos dispuestos y un nivel de conciencia, de posicionamiento en el poder álmico verdadero que somos. Entonces van a ir apareciendo otras leyes. Así que, bueno, no apareciendo, perdón, las vamos a ir descubriendo.
Sí.
Y ahora, así me quedo con bueno, que ahora entran con los chakras y todo, pero igual este apartado que hiciste, eso, me gustó mucho. Gracias.
Sí, está súper. Además, como siempre, muy variado las preguntas del público, el tema de la sorpresa que nos han dado con la preencarnación.
Sí.
Súper increíble este taller, o sea, no tiene desperdicio. Y además tendrían que poner siempre ese ambiente, ¿no? Tan colorido, y la grabación. Se nota la luz, ¿no? Que no es artificial, que en los otros talleres están en sitios más cerrados. Pero bueno, tontería.
Sí, sí. Sí, no, pero sí se nota la pizarra pequeña y bueno, el trabajar juntos, que después no se los ve tanto más que en preguntas y respuestas aquí, pero en un plan más desestructurado totalmente. Sí, buenísimo. Gracias, Iván.
Sí, no, gracias a vosotras. Y Ana está por ahí, a ver cómo se te oye ahora. Bueno, ya despídete y ahora hablamos un poco a ver cómo estamos.
Justo, quise toser. Sí, la verdad que muy claro, muy dinámico, y como que me da ganas de volverlo a ver e ir deteniéndome en puntos como esto de la reencarnación, profundizar, y lo que dice Clau, ¿no? Que no se necesita hacer ningún esfuerzo y reconocer el diseño divino, ¿no?
Y
nada
eso,
más uno estar en esto, como dicen ellos, y siempre lo repiten, de uno focalizar en esto, el deseo, el amor, los 3 puntos que señalaba. No sé cómo se escucha ahora.
Sí, se escucha un poco parecido, pero se escucha. Sí, lo que decías de detenerse, porque fíjate que todas las afirmaciones que hacen a veces son muy simples, pero son tan profundas, tienen tantas consecuencias, ya solo el hecho de lo del alma gemela, que hay mucho que sentir ahí, ¿no? Pues solo con una de estas afirmaciones, en realidad, rezando por sentirla de alguna manera, porque claro, esto lo tenemos que empezar a ya no conocer intelectualmente, sino a sentir como empezamos a hacernos, sentir cada una de las cosas emocionalmente, o sea, conocerlas emocionalmente. Y cuanto más simples son, yo creo que es más profundo y más difícil es conocerlas emocionalmente, estas cosas. Y por eso el mundo se llena de entretenimientos, adicciones y de historias, que va precisamente en contra de ese movimiento que has sugerido, ¿no? De detenerse. Sí.
Y específicamente imaginar, Iván, digamos, si la concepción, o sea, los hijos de esas almas gemelas que comprometidas con ambos con su proceso y en armonía con el amor y la verdad, claro, entonces, por decir, está atacado el primer eslabón, si se quiere. En realidad no hay, como él dijo en un taller, no sé, me estás preguntando si es primero el huevo o la gallina, pero bueno, quién está primero, y sí comprendo que por ahí, pero yo digo, en la deconstrucción, en el devenir, atacar justamente la reunión álmica, digamos, en este plano, como que sí, la verdad es que es muy triste, es muy triste. La experiencia, pensaba en compartir esto que decía Ana, volver a mirarlo y también compartir con mis hijos, a pesar de todo lo que, por decir, no pude procesar ni yo, pero sí invitarlos a escuchar de todo. En realidad no comparto todo siempre, pero puntualmente, que ellos incluso lo recortan y, como decís vos, lo hacen muy de bolsillo, así práctico, y lo compartiría así, aunque ellos no hayan profundizado mucho otras cuestiones, porque realmente parece tan bello y para que puedan comparar con lo que es la experiencia de la sexualidad tal como se la vive, ¿no? Y la idea de amor y todo esto.
Sí.
Gracias.
Claro. Vale, pues entonces ahora voy a dejar de grabar. Muchas gracias y nada, hasta la siguiente.
Muchas gracias.